We are going to Zoom here, and I will just fill this space with my voice for a little bit to make sure your audio is working. All right. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Brittany Boston. I am with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. And me, along with Dalton and Amy, will be helping just kind of facilitate today's meeting, monitor the chat, all those fun things. Just some housekeeping items here. We are on Zoom meeting, so you are able to turn your camera on if you would like to do so. You are also able to unmute for questions, comments. We always just ask that you are mindful of that. So if you have to step away for any reason, take a call, whatever the case may be, make sure your camera is off, you are muted. And also be aware that we are recording today's meeting. So if you do not want your video being recorded, we would ask that you turn your camera off because we are recording and we'll be posting this on our YouTube site and then sharing it out as a resource later. If you have any technical issues and need a little additional support, please feel free to private message either myself or Dalton, and we will do our best to take care of you. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Patty to get us started today.
Thanks, Brittany, and welcome everybody to webinar number 4. So this is the last in this series that I'm doing with you about non-credit to credit transitions. And today we're going to look at how to really scale this and institutionalize the framework. So again, I feel like this idea of organizational culture is critical to, especially to institutionalizing this movement at your school. So we're going to definitely do a bit of chatting about culture. And then I was also thinking that one of the tools that I think is helpful when you're trying to work within a culture is this idea of systems thinking. So we're going to talk about that a bit. And then I'm going to give you some examples of kind of how I see structure and systems thinking and culture kind of playing into this idea of how you use structures and alignment to really make this go. And then I do have a case study for you from San Jacinto College in Texas that did some work for non-credit to credit transition, and just some of the pieces that they put in place I think are kind of helpful to think about. So, and then as always, I'll just give you a couple of resources, mostly from this session, and then as always, my contact information at the end. So if you have questions, definitely give me a shout. Okay, so when we think about culture, or in this case, I'm calling it the cultural pain points in non-credit to credit transition. When we look at all of the stages that we want to implement, you can see places where culture plays a role, right? Like when we think about in this first bucket, choosing a starting point, when you're going to remove structural divides, that's going to lean into the culture of the organization to make that successful. If you pick developing bridge tools to award credit as your starting point, again, that's going to lean into the culture of the organization, right? And even if you're doing things like industry-focused programs as credit-based or orienting non-credit training in demand-driven pathways, all of these touch on an organization's culture, mostly because the way you're organized has something to say about culture. So any of these movements where we're looking at transitioning from non-credit to credit, we're also going to be touching on an institution's culture. And then you can see in other buckets here, like the lay the groundwork, there's literally a bullet point called address institutional culture. So for some of these, it's more called out in an explicit kind of way. But then when you're also just looking at things like change management, how you communicate about the change has something to do with your culture. How you support your implementation has something to do with culture, right? How you look at data and think about data. All of these pieces, in my opinion, have something to do with the culture of the organization. And then just like, again, as we kind of look at if removing structural divides was one of your starting points that you chose, you can see the ways in which culture is going to play into this, right? So if we think about removing structural divides as we're going to unite non-credit and credit departments, divisions, functional areas, that is going to require to do some thinking about how to navigate that within your culture. And that usually when you're removing those structural divides, thinking about how you coordinate functions, how you communicate across functions, how policies and procedures exist, what are those other systems that need to take place in terms of registration, enrollment, payment, all of that kind of stuff. And then thinking also about those job descriptions, all of these pieces are really going to require a bit of transformational leadership to really make these mechanisms be things that you can navigate. So a few sessions ago, we talked about these four kinds of culture. And one of the things I really liked about how you all thought about culture that day was when I asked you to identify which of these four cultures seems to be the one in your organization, many of you picked, frankly, two, which I think is great insight, right? It's probably not that you live within a pure adhocracy culture, right? Or a pure clan culture. Your culture may have pieces of more than one thing, and that's perfectly fine. But I think then that also gives you potentially more opportunities about some strategies to negotiate your culture. So I want to just revisit each of the cultures and talk a little more about what I'm calling the culture's kind of identifiers. Like these are the hallmark pieces of culture, and then some strategies that you might use in the event that you find yourself inside that culture. So as I'm going through these, go ahead and jot down some ideas about what culture you think you may be, and then which strategies you can see yourself implementing to try to move non-credit to credit initiatives forward at your organization. So the first culture we're going to talk about is adhocracy. And this is the culture where really like innovation is kind of their rallying cry, right? So they think about kind of entrepreneurial mindsets. They're really about innovation, creative problem solving, taking risks. There's really a lot of flexibility in how you get things done. And there's also what I would call a low shame quotient. So if you try something and it does not work out, nobody holds it over your head for 100 years. It's more just like, hey, you tried it, it didn't work out. Let's like regroup and figure out what we're going to do. So that is kind of the identifier bucket for adhocracies. If you think you might be in an adhocracy, strategies to use then are approaching non-credit to credit transition as a kind of experiment, right? I also put on here run with scissors. Like it's a way to also kind of get folks excited about maybe doing things a little bit differently than they've been done in the past, about kind of challenging boundaries and thinking about new ways to kind of imagine the student experience. So I'm calling that running with scissors. Another strategy that adhocracies use is this idea of flat structure. So it's not that every decision needs to be run past the VP and the president. It really is more that everybody on the team is peer and a peer in the power structure. So ideas can come from anywhere at the table, and anyone at the table can make a decision. So it isn't really going to be hierarchical in how you make these pieces move together. And again, kind of the root of all this is this idea of creative problem solving. So you're allowed to acknowledge a box exists, but you don't need to stay in the box in order to actually get where you're trying to get in implementing this idea. So if you think you may be an adhocracy, write down a strategy that you think could maybe work for you in moving the non-credit to credit transition forward. The second culture is clan culture. And I do feel like This is definitely a dominant culture in post-secondary community college universes. So this is the culture where folks describe the college as a family. So if you've described your own college that way, or perhaps when you were interviewing for your current position, somebody on that interview team described your institution as a family, you may be in a clan culture. Key identifiers also include emphasis on collaboration, emphasis on teamwork, building this sense of community at your institution. And in order for the community to hold, it really requires mutual trust of all the members and loyalty to the institution. So if you think you're in a clan culture, the strategies that you're going to want to look at include things like heavy employee involvement. So your team is not going to be small. It's going to be very broad. It's going to include folks from across the institution, even folks who you might think may or may not have a ton to say about a given topic. But in order to have this community in your clan culture, you're going to need to have broad employee involvement to make this work. Another strategy that you can do in clan cultures is mentorship. So it's the idea of kind of like the more senior members of the team mentor the newer members on the team. It can also be mentorship in terms of content. So folks who are really experts in workforce, let's say, or in CTE, can then mentor other folks who maybe come from enrollment or maybe come from advising. So that you're really kind of using mentorship to make that team stronger and to be able to increase collaboration and increase teamwork, because now kind of the level setting has happened across all the functional areas. And then related to that, I think, is professional growth. So a pitch you may make as you're trying to encourage your colleagues to participate in your non-credit to credit transition activities is this idea that it will help grow them professionally. And that generally speaking, too, clan cultures use investment in employees as one of the strategies that, again, kind of helps create low turnover, loyalty, mutual trust. So again, positioning this as an opportunity to invest in employees could be a way that you can maybe get buy-in from upper administration, but it can also be the way you get buy-in from your colleagues to participate. So if you think you're in a clan culture, or if clan culture is maybe one of your two cultures, pick a strategy off here that you think could maybe be the angle that you could use. I'll give you another second to look at that. Okay, the third culture we're going to talk about is hierarchy. And again, this is the kind of, I mean, it is what it sounds like. In this kind of culture, decisions are very linear. There's a strict kind of chain of command that's followed when any initiatives are undertaken. And the upside of that, though, is for the most part, there's a clear structure. Roles are very defined, and for the most part, work gets done on time and as advertised. So, not a lot of flexibility, but definitely a lot of control. So, the identifiers then are things like quality control mechanisms. You probably also have a lot of processes to make sure that things are actually on target, meeting metrics. So you may be the kind of organization that does not just annual reports, but you maybe do quarterly reports. You maybe do regular check-ins about different kinds of initiatives, that kind of thing. This culture also really looks at internal efficiency. So you're not going to see processes where it's ridiculously layered. It's very much going to be like processes that have a handful of steps and you're able to get from soup to nuts. And then because of that, they have very reliable operations. So if you were going to cut a check, you can basically set your watch to the amount of time it takes from when you put the request in to the day that the check pops out. Very reliable operations. And again, this idea of chain of command. So everybody has a supervisor who kind of signs off on whatever the idea is. So if you think you may be in a hierarchy, then the strategies you want to lean into are these kinds of things like how we use this process as a way to really prioritize stability. And that can be stability, however we define it in this case. So it can be that we're going to make programs more stable because everything that has a non-credit to credit transition is going to have an additional feeder to those credit programs, and that provides more stability, maybe for those credit programs to continue on, let's say. But it could also provide stability in a way that we think about the student experience, right? So students are going to be able to get on a lovely, seamless pathway from non credit to credit to degree, let's say, or to advanced certificate. And that kind of stability is a real valued piece in hierarchical cultures. So if you think that kind of strategy, that kind of positioning could maybe be something that works for you, and you're in a hierarchical culture, I think that could work great. Other things to think about are things like efficiency and consistency. So, one of the things that I've been seeing as we talk about credit for prior learning is we're trying to figure out how that is an efficient way to implement non credit to credit, right? Like it's definitely efficient for students, but then when we think about could we make charts that have this non credit course certificate series equals this credit course certificate or series, that's very efficient, right? It doesn't include a lot of extra people to weigh in on that part of the process. You've already met and predetermined things. So there's kind of this lovely efficiency that comes with that. So you can also then position this project as it's going to increase efficiency. And then that kind of then drives the rest of the process. But if you have those pieces in place, then you're also going to do consistent implementation. And I think when I told you a little bit about my story at JJC, we were really looking at consistent implementation as one of the really key takeaways of our non-credit to credit process, right? That we wanted to make sure students could experience consistency and it wasn't just going to be like a secret handshake somewhere, right? And then I think connected to that is this idea of transparency and decision making. So if you have folks at your institution who are maybe feeling like the non-credit to credit transition is a way to open transparency, that could really work well in a hierarchical culture. Again, like I think in my own story, that was something we were, again, in terms of consistency, I feel like consistency and transparency kind of go hand in hand, right? So that I think for us was another thing that was really important. So if you think you're in a hierarchical culture, look at the strategies and write one down that you think could maybe be something you could see yourself using as kind of a way to position your non-credit to credit work. And then that brings us to the final type of culture, which is market culture. And this is really rooted more in competition and kind of cornering the market, and it can be a bit of a high pressure environment. So the identifiers in a market culture are things like very results oriented. So it's about sales, it's about credit hours sold, it's about students in seats, right? Like very much that kind of results oriented. It can then, because of that, be a very competitive place to work. So if you feel like maybe you're always in competition with another division at your institution, you may be in a market culture. And at the end of the day, the thing that is really praised at your institution, if you're a market culture, is that you met the bottom line and you met your metrics. Like that's really that identifier. So if you're in a market culture, then some of the strategies that speak to market culture are things like continuous improvement. So you've met all the sales quotas this year, and then next year you're going to exceed that. And here's the process where you're going to be able to do that. You're going to look at what you've currently done, figure out what the tweaks are you need to make so that you can meet next year's goals. So when you think about non-credit to credit, transition, you would then position it thinking about how that feature feeds continuous improvement, right? So again, whether you're going to think about like the student experience and how that flow helps with continuous improvement, or if you're going to think about how curriculum alignment speaks to continuous improvement, how systems efficiency speaks to continuous improvement, that's going to be kind of your strategy. Market cultures also reward these two things: excellence and having met your target. So, thinking also then about non credit to credit, is there a way then that this piece of the process becomes a mark of excellence and then you can kind of reward the excellence, whether that's most colleges have some kind of like employee recognition internal system. So is it something where once this is implemented and you've figured it out and it's up and running and students are easily transitioning, then everybody who worked as part of that team gets rewarded for this piece of excellence? Or it can also be it's rewarding because we've met this goal, we're going to meet this target, right? We're going to move this many students through. So that is your strategy bucket if you think you may be in a market culture. So I will give you a second or two to see if you want to write one of these down if you think you are in a market culture. Okay, so hopefully you really did take notes, because now here's the part where I want you to tell me what you wrote down. So we're going to do a waterfall about cultural strategy, and I want you to think about these two things. Which strategy do you think would work well to support your non-credit to credit transition work at your college based on the culture or two that you think is your institutional culture? And then what would be a first step you could take to implement that strategy? So take a minute and write down these two things in the chat. Don't hit enter yet. I'll let you know when we're ready to hit enter. You have about another 10 seconds. Okay, go ahead and hit enter if you've finished writing. If you haven't finished writing, go ahead and keep writing and then hit enter. So I like that you're sticking with the pattern we talked about before, which is a combination of various kinds of cultures, right? So Kristen, I see combination of hierarchy and market, and working on transparency, yeah, by creating micro credentials and a pathway intake process. That's great. Interest, employee involvement, and creating a list of who to involve, right? Yes. And I think something I've talked to several of you about that's going to come up again in a minute when we talk about systems thinking is you can create a team that has kind of regularly standing characters. And then you can also invite kind of guest stars in to look at just a specific piece of the process if you realize that that's an easier ask, right? Like sometimes it's difficult to get people to commit to something that really could uh, uh, take meetings over a year or over maybe more, as was the case in my story. But we also did a thing where we would have people just come in to talk about data or just come in to talk about a specific piece of financial aid, right? So when you're thinking about who to involve, also be thinking about that kind of flexibility and whether you need them as a standing member or whether they can be kind of a guest star, right? Irina, right? Departmental collaboration that leads to efficiency. Yeah, right. If efficiency is really kind of one of the hallmarks of your organization, then definitely thinking about ways that collaboration lends itself to efficiency, I think is great. Or Sarita, right? Results and data and collaboration, great. Yeah, I see a lot of collaboration in the comments. Yeah. Christine, I like this idea about how non-credit and credit collaboration benefits both sides of that equation and thinking about kind of how you build that in as the value proposition. I think that's a really smart approach. Yeah. And Cheryl, definitely this idea about how using credit for prior learning can really help with efficiency and also transparency. That was certainly true in my case. Or Kathy, thinking about interdepartmental partnerships and collaboration. Yep. Consistent implementation, Carissa. Thank you. Yep. And Debbie, credit for prior learning. Yeah. Great. These are all, I feel like you really, when you start to think about the culture, you really get clarity on which strategies are going to be the ones that help you move forward and which strategies aren't going to work as well. um, in order to kind of help you continue to think about this, I do want to talk a little bit about systems thinking because I feel like this again gives you a little more clarity as you're maneuvering inside your institutions and working with all of these kinds of cultural forces. So, when we talk about systems thinking, we're really thinking about these three buckets. So, inclusivity, engagement, and then recognition, but also support. And because this thing is so interdependent, right? It's a system. So the pieces are going to be interdependent. You're going to want to revisit how you organize your committee kind of on a regular basis to make sure that you've got all the right people for the tasks at hand. So let's talk about each of these pieces. So when we talk about inclusivity, what we really mean is in order to think about the whole system, you're going to have a pretty broad sample across functional areas at your institution. And what sometimes happens is you may ask the head of a department to please give you somebody for this committee, and sometimes you don't end up with the right person because they may be targeting somebody that they think has time to do this activity, and you're thinking, I need the person with a in-depth understanding of what it is we are talking about. So when you make your ask for the person from any given department, you want to make sure you're very specific about the knowledge and experience that you need that person to have and to be able to contribute to the group. And that also part of inclusivity, it's not just that you want that person to be on that team so that they can speak to that department's concerns. But ideally, what's going to happen is everyone's going to share their in-depth knowledge, and everyone is going to then kind of grow their own knowledge. But to that end, what we want to really see is everybody has then kind of a common understanding about the different concerns across the system. And again, this idea of deliberate working groups. So when you're setting out to think, here's going to be the project, here are going to be the pieces of information that we need, here are the kinds of folks who hold that information, you're really going to be, I said deliberate, but I feel like it's also just intentional about, who ends up on the working group and then what the work is of that group. So we want to be inclusive, but it's really inclusivity by design, not happenstance. So don't just put people on the committee just to satisfy that you have somebody from each functional area. I really feel like bullet number 2 here about targeting the folks with the in-depth understanding. You need the right folks with the right knowledge to actually make this work. And then the next piece for systems thinking is engagement. And what we really mean is that like you maintain engagement throughout your entire process. So you're going to define the problem, but give the problem a little room to breathe. I think sometimes we think, okay, here's what we're trying to do, or like I said, define the problem, but it could also just be like define the solution, define the situation, but allow breathing in there so that you can change it as you start to move along the path. You may realize, like, hey, we thought we could do this, but we realize we can't really do that right now. We have to do this other piece first. So, in order to allow these ideas to have room to breathe, you're really going to need to make sure that your subject matter experts from your various functional areas can really like take charge and also make change and develop potential solutions that will work for their area and the other areas. And then the last piece is really more about the support that you need from the institution. So thinking about the skills that you need, but also like what's the logistical support that you need? What's your vision? What's your timeline? And then that leadership is amplifying your group's message about the work. But any work group is only going to be as good as the skills, logistical support, and vision that it puts together. So I would say, like, as you're starting out your work, focus on thinking through those three pieces first. And then if there are more skills that you need, again, ask leadership to help you identify that. If there's additional logistical support you need, again, reach out to leadership. I feel like once you've kind of organized your vision and mission and timeline become a little clearer to you. But to me, this idea of support, I don't necessarily mean financial. I mean, maybe it is, but I feel like it's more these other pieces about how leadership can amplify the message, how they can help you find the skills and the logistical support to make it work. And then I don't know how many of you subscribe to Harvard Business Review, but there, if you do, dig out this month's issue, the March April issue. They have a fantastic article in there called "Why Great Innovations Fail to Scale," and they talk about this kind of systems thinker known as a bridger. And what I would say is get a bridger onto your team. It doesn't have to be you, but it needs to be a human who's able to do these things. So here's what bridgers are able to do. Bridgers are able to look across your institution and curate for you who the stakeholders are who are going to know the things you need to know and contribute in a way that's helpful. Um, Bridgers also are people who speak not just the language of their own functional area, but they're able to speak the language of other functional areas. So, because of that, they can then kind of translate messages across the stakeholders and build the bridges. See, hence the name. And then they also do a really good job of listening and kind of collating information so you get better integration. And you can see like how they do it is through a series of mutual events. So trust, influence, and commitment. And I feel like as I'm describing a bridger in your mind, you're if it's not you, you've probably already pictured a human at your organization who you think it is. Yes. And Christina, I'm glad you have this. I'm telling you, this article is fantastic. Get your hands on it. I've linked it at the bottom of the PowerPoint, and then it's also at the end of things. So okay, so let's think about systems thinking and how you might use inclusivity, engagement, and recognition and support. Or remember at the bottom, I just put like you'll also need to revisit the configurations. So if you even just want to think about how you might revisit your system team, that's perfectly fine too. So again, let's take a minute and give this some thoughts. And before I do though, Sarita, if you think you're the bridger, you're the bridger. if you can't think of another human who does this thing I'm talking about, and there may be more than one bridger at your institution, and the great thing is they can be found anywhere. So I think we often think, oh, the bridger must be the vice president. But in my experience, the bridger is usually not at the upper level. They're usually mid manager and below is sort of where the folks are. Okay, so thinking about systems thinking, think about how you might use one of these ideas: inclusivity, engagement, recognition, or revisiting. And then just tell me which of those tasks you'll be using and what you think you might do with that in your institution. And I'll give you another 30 seconds since I was talking for most of that time. Okay, when you're ready, go ahead and hit enter. And if you're still writing, finish writing and then hit enter. You can hit enter when you're ready. Are you all not feeling systems thinking? It's okay. I'll keep going. We'll come back. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about structures and alignment and how these pieces can kind of when you're thinking about especially systems thinking and inclusivity kind of like across the organization, I feel like some of these buckets are kind of important to think about. So sometimes one of the things that kind of gets us stuck is that there's a misalignment between culture and strategy, right? Like when we start to think about how non-credit and credit approach some functions, some of the ways we do things are just different. So these were some of the things that either I've seen or you've raised as issues when we've been chatting. So things like how we do recruitment and marketing may be a little bit different non-credit to credit. How we do enrollment processing, this seems to be a big one, is different from non-credit to credit. How we handle payment. I'm going to skip number 4 for just a second. And how we do data collection, because the mechanisms currently set up at most institutions function almost like we're two different colleges inside one college. And the one place I feel like we sort of do agree is post completion life. That's why I put a little asterisk there. I feel like non credit and credit, the aim for both is towards um, designing programs where graduates can get jobs, right? So I feel like post completion life in many regards, we agree that employment is kind of the ultimate outcome. Although on the credit side, there maybe is more of a path, let's say, through more advanced credentials or various degrees. But I feel like we can sort of agree that like we want students to get jobs. And as I kind of went down that rabbit hole, I came back to this slide that I used at our convening in February by with this article that Dr. Kathy Taylor at Elgin wrote about these kinds of buckets where she can see collaboration versus disintegration, and especially things like duplicating contacts with employers, having kind of muddy messaging, having calendars that don't really jive, having separate program approval processes, having, as we were just talking about, duplicated systems around enrollment, advising, other payment, all those other kinds of things. And then ultimately, all of that kind of leads to this unclear pathway for students, which we're trying to clarify. And I thought, like, if we kind of take one of these buckets and kind of walk it through the cultural piece, I think it gets a little clearer what we need to do. So when we think about Dr. Taylor's idea about duplicating employer contacts, right? That you have somebody from the credit side, someone from the non-credit side, everybody's reaching out to the employer. Depending on the culture, this may be what you're seeing. If you're in an adhocracy culture, you may be seeing that non-credit is getting to the employer and talking about like, we're going to do fast custom training. And the credit side doesn't really get to make that pitch because in an adhocracy culture, whoever gets there first makes the pitch. In a clan culture, what you're probably more likely to see is that folks on either side, credit, non-credit, are kind of hoarding their contacts and protecting those relationships and not sharing contacts and information. And that results then in duplication of effort. In a market culture, what you may see is kind of like what we see in adhocracy, where there's a competition and whoever gets to the employer first kind of wins that contract with them. And if you're in a hierarchical culture, what you're probably going to see is the non-credit workforce folks are going to be able to move a little faster. The credit side is going to be a little bit slower and have kind of what I'm calling siloed outreach, where it may not really come from the academic piece. It may end up coming from like career services or somewhere else kind of in student development. So that to me is sort of like if we look at these disintegration pieces and then use a lens of culture, this sort of explains a little bit what it is that we're seeing. And then and then I guess this is the other piece of this is like as rough as you think you may have it, the employers are even more frustrated with the experience, right? Because like this is their perspective of what they're receiving from us, right? They get competing colleges from the same college. They have multiple points of contact. They now are receiving conflicting messaging, and there's a lot of confusion about the offerings. So, a way to kind of satisfy this disintegration by leaning into your culture is if we think about ways that we can kind of be intentionally leveraging the best of each culture instead of kind of incubating the worst of each culture. So if we think about adhocracy, the best part of adhocracy is they can do rapid solutions, right? Market culture is really about clear return on investment and how do you quantify that? How do you talk about that? Hierarchical cultures really are interested in promoting quality and clear pathways, and clan cultures are all about relationship continuity. So we've had this relation for a long time. We want to continue to maintain this. So if we think about those pieces, then we can think about, okay, the employer would really enjoy a single coordinated entry point and just some really clear layered solution. So the messaging then could be things like we have short-term training and yield long-term pathways. So trying to kind of think about presenting ourselves as like one talent partner instead of fractioned um, colleges within colleges. So to me, like that's one way to kind of think about how you can take your culture and take the best of both worlds and put that into the employer experience so that we don't really do the duplicated employer contact in a way that harms that relationship. This muddy messaging was another one of Dr. Taylor's issues. So I want to just talk about that and culture. So as an example, muddy messaging is things like this. You have a website and on one part of the website, it says short-term training leads to jobs quickly. On another part of the website, it says you need to complete a 2-year degree for career success, right? So right there, you've already got some conflicting messaging. We also sometimes have different names for very similar programs, which again, in our internal processes may make sense, but when you're marketing to an external consumer, there may be too much similarity about certificates versus credentials or badging. So this becomes again kind of muddy. Also, we don't always do a good job marketing a nice clear pathway from non-credit to credit. And ultimately, we do engage in some internal competition for the same students. So again, if we think about like how we could kind of blend cultures here to align messaging, if you find yourself as like adhocracy and hierarchy, then really adhocracy is the thing that enables you to do things quickly, and hierarchy is really about quality and pathways. Then you could create a single tagline for messaging that's something like start quickly, build credentials that last. So you're honoring both pieces of your organizational culture, but you're bringing the messaging together so that it's in alignment. Similarly, or perhaps differently, if you're like a market culture and a clan culture, then really the market culture is looking at career outcomes and the clan culture is looking at student supports and belonging. So the tagline that brings those together could be something like gain skills employers need will guide you every step of the way, right? So you've got the market piece in the gaining skills and the clan piece in the guiding you every step of the way. So it's a way to kind of bring these seemingly divergent kinds of cultural elements together in messaging that makes sense for students. Okay, so let's see if we can do another waterfall. So for this one, looking at these non-credit to credit conflicts, have you addressed one of these at your institution? And if so, how did you overcome it? So I'll give you a minute to put something into the chat, and then I'll tell you when to hit enter. Okay, go ahead and hit enter. So Joel, you worked on program approval and duplicated systems as the conflicts that needed to get addressed. Good, good. And Christina, unclear path. Yeah. Yeah, I think advertising and thinking about messaging becomes really central to how successful this project is going to be at your institution. Sometimes I feel like when I end up at like family reunions or other kinds of community picnics, and sooner or later somebody's asking for advice about things, you start to realize like how complicated some of our processes are when you're trying to explain them to lay people. Yeah. So Rita, I think that's great that like thinking about how to take all the people with the various contacts and then kind of how do we create a working document of who those folks are and who the contacts are. I've also seen things where you'll put together kind of a database like that, and then as part of it somebody is kind of the primary contact from the institution for that employer. So also thinking about that the institution doesn't do multiple outreaches, but that the colleagues at the institution reach out to the colleague who has that contact, and then that person makes the connection. Yeah. Yep. And I feel like, Stephanie, so Unclear Path, I feel like a lot of colleges have done work in the last 10 years or so to think about like what is the pathway on the credit side. The piece that seems to be missing is thinking about how non-credit becomes the funnel in or like the on-ramp to credit. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And Christine, I see what you're saying, right? It's not that it's muddy messaging, it's just no messaging, zero messaging, maybe, right? So thinking about that. But again, like to be thinking about like how you position your organizational culture and the message so that there's some synchronicity there. And then to also be doing sort of an audit of your websites and look at where are you maybe transmitting conflicting information. We don't always do that kind of holistic view, I think. Yep, Christian program approval and looking at micro credentials that lead to pathways. That's great. Yeah, and I think duplicated employer contacts and muddy messaging are common, very, very common. Yeah. Oh, and Jolie had to say HLC. Which then becomes like a whole other piece of this, right? Is like like making sure that how programs are approved, that we're in compliance with various entities and what they want us to have too. Yeah, okay. Yeah, duplicated employer contacts. Yes, well done, everybody. Okay, and then wrapping this up, I just want to point to a brief case study at San Jacinto College in Texas. And they were interested in removing structural divides as their non-credit to credit transition. And these were some of the kind of steps that they took to and the thoughts they had about how to make this happen. So one of the things they were interested in doing was reducing what we're going to call the student process burden, right? So when you look at your non-credit to credit transition process, to be thinking about how many stops in your institution does that student need to make in order to make that transition. So trying to reduce that student process burden was a big deal for them. So thinking about like, okay, if right now the process is 8 steps, can you get it down to 6? Can you get it down to 4 or 2 or 1, and related to that, they also are looking at what are the digital mechanisms that they could use in order to make some of these work. And I'll show you their workflow process in a second, and you'll see places in there where things are digitized. And then the other piece they were looking at was when they were doing credit for prior learning, they wanted to get those fees down to 0, which I realize like may not be possible at your institution, but just be advised there are institutions out there that are able to make that work. So if you are looking for somebody doing it, here's a school that is doing it. They also had initially 3 hours as the requisite residency hours before credit for prior learning could be transcribed. And they got that down to 1 credit hour, which I think may end up being like an hour that you take as the course where you're doing the portfolio assessment, but I'm not, don't quote me on that, but I think that might be what that was. And then they also did this huge mapping process to look at non-credit courses and credit courses and figure out the equivalency. So if you go visit their website, which I have on these slides, you can also kind of see their mapped courses and how detailed all of that is. So when they then were trying to kind of lay the groundwork and manage the change, they did a lot of work in work groups. They wanted to make sure that they documented the rationale for any course where it was like the course is equivalent non-credit to credit, or the industry credential is equivalent to this credit course. They really made sure that documenting the rationale for how things are equal was really developed as part of their culture and how they got buy-in. They also made a lot of templates and did a lot of training and created or updated their credit for prior learning manual, so that all of these pieces could then really be institutionalized regardless of who is or isn't at the institution anymore. And related to that, they developed a common language between non-credit and credit so that we agree certain terms mean the same kinds of things. And then this is their digital workflow. I realize it's a little bit it's a little bit small and fuzzy, but the thing I like about the workflow is it includes a branch for credit by industry credential, but then also credit by assessment. And then looking through the workflow, various pieces are automated. So when students submit something, there's an automated response that the student receives while the humans are working on the actual determination. So it's not just that students submit something and it kind of goes into this vacuum, but like for every student action, there's some kind of automated immediate reaction. And I thought that was kind of great. And including in that then like what the student should expect is happening next. So I thought that was kind of neat in terms of like student support and student experience. And then, so you see how complicated this map is, right? So having seen the complexity of that map, and thinking about your own processes that you're working through, which practices do you think are going to need the most detailed map? And which colleagues do you want to engage in the mapping process? So we'll just do one final waterfall. Joel, I see your question. I was working under the assumption that you I don't think you have to charge. I think the rule is written so that it's you can't charge in excess of X, but I don't know that it says you have to charge a minimum. But I can go visit that language and send it to you later. Yeah. And Irina, I think that's really, I think again, one of the things I really liked about the San Jacinto model was that idea of reducing the student process burden, because I think we're so good at building these kinds of elaborate processes that we don't really always think about what it must feel like for a student to have to go through all of those steps, right? It kind of becomes this like hellacious game of chutes and ladders. And I think anything you can do to reduce the student process burden is a good thing. So good. All right, well, keep putting things in the chat. Meanwhile, I'm going to show you just there is a page here where I put the organizational culture articles, systems thinking. I did put that HBR article on Bridgers. If you don't have it handy, definitely check that out. And then for San Jacinto, they have a whole presentation on their non-credit to credit project, but then they also have a credit for prior learning page that has all that information that I think is good and very helpful. Okay, so I think we have, well, not quite a minute. What questions do you have for me about today's show? All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to, and thanks for being such great participators for this 4 webinar series. I had a lot of fun. I hope you guys had fun and learned stuff, and hopefully it's helpful to you in your non-credit to credit transition work. So call me if you have questions or shoot me an email, and Joel, I'll get back to you about if there's a minimum.
Thank you so much, Patty. I put the link in the chat to the website that has the previous recordings and resources from your sessions, and this one will be located there as well by the end of the week, and then additional non-credit items that we've been collecting in webinars all can be accessed through that link. So, Patty, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.